Thank you for joining us on this snowy day, which has closed the U.S. government, but not the Center for New American Security, which is plowing forward with its program on maritime security. Today, we're here to talk about the Association of Southeast Asian Nation, ASEAN's role in maritime security, a very important issue that includes and encompasses the South China Sea. In fact, our distinguished colleague, Robert Kaplan, will be publishing a new book all about the South China Sea, and we will be releasing that at a special event here in Washington on March 25th. But today we're delighted to bring a series of distinguished speakers talking about the perception of security in the maritime space around Southeast Asia, especially the South China Sea, and then to focus on what ASEAN can and should or might do to contribute to maritime security, because there are both challenges in terms of perceived coercion or disputed claims, and at the same time, a desire for risk reduction measures, for good order at sea, for figuring out the rules for adjudicating differences, for building the architecture that indeed ASEAN has contributed to, not just within and among the 10 ASEAN member states, but also the other institutions that ASEAN has encouraged more inclusively to include outside countries. This morning's panel on maritime security in Southeast Asia will begin with remarks from Vice Admiral Alexander Pama, who is Undersecretary in the Office of the Executive Secretary of the Office of the President of the Philippines, so he's still working on a very important governmental task for the Philippines. But prior to this appointment, Admiral Pama was the 32nd Flag Officer in command of the Philippine Navy. He had been Vice Commander of the Philippine Navy and the Naval Inspector General. His stint as the Commander of Naval Forces Western Mindanao from October 2008 to 2010 at the helm of Fleet Marine units earned him the award of Distinguished Service Star, which he received during the Armed Forces of the Philippines' 75th anniversary celebration in 2009. While serving as commander of the Naval Forces Western Mindanao, Vice Admiral Pama was also concurrent commander of the Joint Task Force Trillium, which mounted offensives against Abu Sayyaf in Basilan in Zamboanga. It was also during this term of command that he rescued 443 crew and passengers during the sinking of Super Ferry 9 in September 2009 off the waters of Zamboanga City. So it's a great privilege to have Admiral Pama here, and I will turn to him to open up remarks, and then I will introduce our speakers after that. Admiral Pama.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Before I start, initially I thought the issue or the topic would be challenging, only to realize that the weather in Washington is a lot more challenging. Anyway, to start off, I'd like to put into context China's recent and ongoing disposition relative to the obtaining dynamics in the South China Sea, in particular, and the Southeast Asia region and the world in general. During its heyday, China considered itself as the Middle Kingdom, or the center of the world. In those times, she had what is called in the Chinese language, Fuxiang, meaning wealth and power. China, however, lost its glory days during the period referred to as the century of humiliation, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Consequently, this nurtured among its people a profound and obstinate aspiration to bring back her glory days. Today, we see a resurgent China on a hyperdrive to regain its glory days. This has become a national obsession, unabashedly called, and I quote, China Dream. As China's President Xi Jinping would put it, and I quote, a China-centered Pacific, or a community of common destiny led by China, or the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Today, there are indications that China's goal of bringing back her glory days is coming to fruition. Admittedly, the rise of China as the second largest economy in the world in a matter of only about 3 decades is proof enough that said glory days can be a reality. The wealth element of Fuxiang has been achieved, and it continues to grow. What remains to be acquired is the power element. For China, this power is none other than having a strong military, not only for an effective and strong defense and deterrence, but more so for her to wield and use when she so desires and or needs to. The successes of China in the past 3 decades, particularly the economic front, gave impetus to a stronger sense of nationalism among its people that consequently, and I quote, gave rise to a lot of pressure from the people for the government to be more assertive in their protection and for the pursuit of China's interests, end of quote. These interests are more explicitly manifest in the issues that China has declared to be among her core interests. From the perspective of the Chinese people, China's current status is almost there, in quotations, in relation to their China dream, but not yet, since the power element has not yet been fully achieved. Thus, we now see a China engaged in an energetic military buildup, where the military power in the equation is not yet at the level where it is fully at par with the present military powers of the world. The measures and methodology that China is pursuing, using these military and paramilitary apparatus to eventually attain their interests, are what we see happening today in the South and East China Seas and elsewhere. It is a methodology of deliberate, calibrated, and incremental moves and actions in the South China Sea to further assert its will and pursue its core interest. China's current posture of assertiveness, therefore, is a clear manifestation of its deliberate intent to utilize her wealth and test the surging strength of her military and paramilitary apparatus in order to appease the demands of mounting domestic nationalism characterized by the people's desire for the government to advance the attainment of China's core interests. What are China's practical interests in the South China Sea? Notwithstanding the foregoing issues, there are practical reasons and anticipated benefits that China expects from an unchallenged possession of the South China Sea. This justifies her assertiveness in her unabashed claims of practically the whole of South China Sea. And these are specifically, first, the marine resources. Considering the food requirement of its huge population, the South China Sea is China's main source of fisheries and other marine resources. It is a critical factor in her food security. Next, the hydrocarbon deposits. Explorations reveal that the South China Sea is reported to hold vast subsea oil and natural gas deposits. Attendant to China's rise to a giant economic power is its need for access to and control of sources of fossil fuel. China's demand for resources, whether oil, gas, or mineral, is surging. Third, the control or dominant influence in a major international shipping lanes. The South China Sea is where $5.3 trillion US dollars worth of international maritime trade passes through. And the fourth, it's an imperative for homeland defense and power projection. Militarily, the South China Sea is of strategic importance to China. It needs her own version of, I quote, Lebensraum. She has to have sufficient standoff at sea area for homeland defense and a springboard for naval operations necessary for a Pacific and global maritime dominance. And China's ambiguous 9-dash line claim. Since the end of World War II, China has been redrawing its maps, redefining borders, renaming maritime features, and seeking to impose its version of history on the waters of the region. First and foremost was the law on the territorial sea in the contiguous zone of the People's Republic of China, adopted at the 24th meeting of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress on 25 February 1992. Under this law, China's territorial land includes the mainland and its offshore islands. China's declared 9-dash line claim in the South China Sea, however, has become the most contentious and controversial among its unilateral acts in its expansionist behavior in the recent past. This unilateral assertion, which it has declared as a core interest, continues to be a source of concern and resistance, especially from countries in the region directly affected by such claims. Asia's regional security outlook has deteriorated steadily since 2009, when China made a submission to the United Nations of its so-called 9-dash line claim, covering 90% of the South China Sea. China anchors its 9-dash line claim on the so-called historical rights, although it admits it was the first included in an official Chinese map only in 1947 during the Kuomintang government. It was originally represented by 11 dashes in the 1947 Chinese map and then reduced unilaterally in 1950 to 9 dashes with that explanation after the communists outed the Kuomintang from the mainland. On 24 July 2012, she officially established the city of Sansha on the Paracels as its administrative base for South China Sea, setting up a local civilian government and a military garrison in the area to oversee the entire region. The party chief of Hainan province said the provincial government will be devoted to turning the city into an important base to safeguard China's sovereignty and serve marine resources development. In January 2013, China released a new official map, added a 10th dash on the eastern side of Taiwan. Until now, she has never revealed the exact coordinates of its 9 or 10 dash line claim, and neither has she explained the basis under international law for its claim. With this map, she claimed indisputable sovereignty over the adjacent waters within the enclosed area, as well as the sovereign right and jurisdiction over the relevant waters, seabed, and subsoil within the enclosed area. The salami slicing strategy. A major destabilizing element in the South China Sea security environment is China's calibrated incremental encroachments into neighboring countries' frontiers and the EEZ. This is her favored frontier strategy to alter the territorial and maritime status quo that is akin to salami slicing, quote unquote. This focuses on a steady progression of small actions, none of which serves as a casus belli by itself, yet which over time can lead cumulatively to a strategic transformation in China's favor. By relying on quiet salami slicing rather than an overt aggression, her strategy aims to seriously limit the options of the targeted countries by confounding their deterrence plans and making it difficult for them to devise proportionate or effective counteractions. The strategy, while stamped with all the hallmarks of modern Chinese brinkmanship, such as reliance on surprise and a disregard for risks of wider military escalation, seeks to ensure the initiative remains with her. The hallmark of the strategy was evident in China's gaining control step by step. Around 1962 of the Aksai Chin Plateau in Jammu and Kashmir, the seizure of Paracels in 1974, the Johnson Reef in 1988, the Mischief Reef in 1995, and most recently the Scarborough Shoal in 2012. Today, the ominous and continuous presence of China Coast Guard and other vessels hovering the vicinity of the Philippine outpost at the Second Thomas Shoal, or Ayungin Shoal as we call it, gives rise to concern the area could be the next slice of the salami, as in the case of the Scarborough Shoal. In the most egregious example of such behavior in the South China Sea, the standoff between vessels from China and the Philippines in April 2012 at the Scarborough or Panatag Shoal, shoal ended with the Chinese occupying the shoal in violation of a reported U.S.-brokered verbal understanding reached with Manila to withdraw all vessels from the area. The standoff began when Chinese maritime surveillance vessels was stopped by Philippine Navy personnel from arresting Chinese poachers and seizing their illegal catch of giant clams, endangered corals, and sharks. The poachers, aided by the CMS vessels, were able to leave with their illegal cargo. The Scarborough incident constituted the first instance of a blatant change in the status quo of a maritime feature in the South China Sea in 1995 when she seized control of Mischief Reef. The employment of this strategy or tactic can best be described as non-militarized coercion, actions that are carefully calibrated to achieve their objective without provoking conflict. It is basically attempting to take disputed territories by calibrated force, continually testing boundaries with the misguided hope that Japan, Southeast Asian nations, and the U.S. will just grudgingly accept it. I quote. The U.S. meanwhile traditionally looked upon as the player that can have the most significant influence in the dynamics in the South China Sea, seems to be sending mixed signals with her pronouncements and actions, resulting to an image, rightly or wrongly, of being equivocal and irresolute. This has arguably enabled China to continue to push the envelope, so to speak, on the ground or at sea, without much effective resistance from other stakeholders, and to a certain extent legitimizes her actions to be the detriment of the small countries such as the Philippines. The seeming lack of a clear, perceivable, and credible position and action on the part of the United States and other major international players makes China's assertive actions effective and undoubtedly boosts the pursuit of her interests. Considering her overt acts, history, foreign policies, and intentions, and further the seemingly passive response on the part of other countries, one thing appears clear. She will continue to utilize her fushang in her salami-slicing tactics and evidently has no plans to stop. The Philippines stand and its actions. As China becomes increasingly assertive and more brazen in its claim of sovereignty in the South China Sea, the Philippines remains uncompromising in its position that the only legitimate and viable way to resolve the dispute with China is a rules-based approach respecting international law. Foreign Affairs Secretary Albert Del Rosario told the Philippine Conference in Washington, D.C. in September 26, 2012, that the country's core interest lies in being able to contribute to ensuring that global security and economic system are based firmly on the rule of law. Along these lines, the Philippine government is implementing a comprehensive foreign policy approach that involves action to be taken in 3 tracks, namely political, diplomatic, and legal. Consonant to the Philippine government's position that the rules-based approach to resolve the disputes, the country in January 2013 has taken the step of bringing China before an arbitral tribunal under Article 287 and Annex 7 of the 1982 UNCLOS, in order to achieve a peaceful and durable solution to the dispute over the West Philippine Sea. The decision was made only after the Philippine government exhausted all political and diplomatic avenues for a peaceful, negotiated settlement of its maritime dispute with China. The salient points in the notification include the Philippines' assertion that the so-called 9-line claim that encompasses virtually the entire South China Sea or West Philippine Sea is contrary to the provisions of UNCLOS. The Philippines further pointed out that within the maritime area encompassed by the 9-line, China has also laid claim to, occupied, and built structures in certain submerged banks, reefs, and low-tide elevations that do not qualify as islands under UNCLOS, but are part of the Philippine continental shelf or the international seabed. In addition, China has occupied certain small, uninhabitable coral projections that are barely above water at high tide, which are classified as rocks under Article 121, Paragraph 3 of UNCLOS. The Philippines also stated that China has interfered with the lawful exercise by the Philippines of its rights within the legitimate maritime zones, as well as to the aforementioned features and their surrounding waters. Reacting to the Philippines' arbitral proceedings on South China Sea issue, China said it remains resolute in its principled position that disputes would be settled by parties concerned through bilateral negotiations. The ASEAN mechanism. The Philippines, as an ASEAN member country, is committed to adhere to the ASEAN policies on the settlement of territorial disputes. It subscribes to and is committed to the ASEAN Declaration of establishing dispute settlement mechanisms that will ensure a rules-based community approach in the West Philippine Sea in all fields of cooperation. The regional grouping stresses putting in place dispute settlement mechanisms with proper institutions and the right resource persons to instill trust and confidence to all stakeholders on the seriousness of the ASEAN in its efforts towards a rules-based community. Despite the norms in the ASEAN Declaration of Conduct in the South China Sea, or DOC, tensions in the South China Sea persisted and even escalated. The Philippines advocates for establishing a regional code of conduct mutually agreed upon by China and the ASEAN member countries. This is envisioned to guide the behavior in China and other claimant countries in the South China Sea to reduce tensions and prevent aggressive actions in the region. We are hopeful that a code can be crafted, implemented as soon as possible. China, however, is perceived to be hedging on this. Among others, it claims that there is no need to rush the code, insisting instead of bilateral negotiations with other claimant countries to resolve the dispute. She continues to reject any multilateral approach in resolving the disputes and remains steadfast in insisting for negotiations on a bilateral basis with other claimants. Hopes and opportunities. In spite of the current state of affairs and the predicament that the region is facing, this may, on the other hand, serve as an opportunity to set things in the right direction. The greatest challenge now is to find opportunities to make China realize and understand the importance of respecting and upholding the rule of law, and set aside her assertiveness in pursuing her interests in the South China Sea. However, the burden of discouraging her to pursue her coercive diplomacy and other bellicosity in the region does not rest on one or two countries alone. Most, if not all, countries in the world should share in this burden, as everyone has a direct or indirect stake in whatever happens in this part of the world. President Benigno Aquino III of the Philippines, in a published interview, stated that, and I quote, "The Philippines faces demands to surrender territory piecemeal to a much stronger power and needs more robust foreign support for the rule of international law if it is to resist." End of quote. Earlier, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan said as much in the World Economic Forum in Davos this year. He said that, and I quote, "The world has to stand up to an increasingly assertive China or risk a regional conflict with catastrophic economic consequences." End of quote. Standing up to China can come in many forms and ways so as to turn down the temperature, so to speak, in the South China Sea. The Philippines, for its part, was constrained to avail of the remedies, such as the arbitral tribunal under the UNCLOS. We hope that a favorable decision in the arbitration will invalidate China's nine-dash-line claim that is openly supported by the international community, will convince China's leadership and people of the unsoundness of the said nine-dash-line claim. As to how China would view and subsequently act on a ruling unfavorable to them, only she can tell. However, her behavior in this scenario would be indicative of and a clear manifestation of her nature when she gets to be, in quotations, a rejuvenated China. It is in this context that we emphasize the critical need for support from the international community in giving these arbitration proceedings its utmost attention and close concern, if only to give it the needed visibility and consideration to ensure that the output or decision of the panel would result to an outcome that would be acceptable to the parties directly involved, as well as the whole international community. To quote British Foreign Minister William Hague, and I quote, "In the international system and within states themselves, a principled and rules-based approach will be critical to stability and growth in the long term." End of quote. Hopefully, a panel decision that would favor a rules-based position and strong international support would provide China's leadership an opportunity, as well as a valid and reasonable justification to present to the Chinese people for them to temper the seeming ultranationalism that foster and propel China's leadership to pursue its China dream in a less assertive and objectionable ways and means. It might hopefully bring China to the realization that it would be folly for it to be obstinate in doing things that are unacceptable to others, especially as it aspires to be a leader in the region and in the world. In conclusion, in view of the foregoing discussions, we can conclude that China, no doubt, has the will and capacity to pursue her China dream. There should be no debate whatsoever that it is her inherent right to do so and achieve it. The question that linger and cause significant apprehension for her neighbors in the region and the world at large, however, are China's methodologies and instruments to achieve such dream. Thus far, her actions to achieve this causes other countries directly affected to be wary, to say the least, of her every move and intent. We are confident that the world can welcome a rejuvenated China, but one that could perhaps lead a region or even a greater community of nations and states anchored in the belief and adherence to the rule of law and other universally accepted principles and norms, and not by one who disregards the rules and conventions set and accepted by the international community. Today, for China to manifest this rules-based character in her pursuit of interests in the South China and East China Seas is significantly important for her to be perceived as a worthy leader in the community of nations. While we are optimistic that reason and respect for international rules and conventions will eventually prevail, we should be attentive to the unfolding events on the ground, or more appropriately, at sea. While there seems to be continuing debates, endless discourse on what is to be done by the international community, individually and collectively in general, and the other major players and stakeholders to the South China Sea situation in particular, China continuously to implement its salami slicing strategy and continuously gain practical advantage on the ground in pursuit of her interests. Given this, we cannot help but wonder as to what and how, in practical terms, do the various pronouncements by the United States and other powers impact on the prevailing situation in the South China Sea. Pronouncements such as, in quotation, rebalance or pivot to Asia, strategic reassurance, and others ring hollow, as this seem to be mere abstractions for us if weighed against the various activities and events currently undertaken by China in line with her salami slicing tactics. If the delay on the conduct of more substantial and meaningful diplomatic, political, or other measures by the powers concerned are deliberate to await a more opportune time, my worry is that we might actually reach the time and condition where China would already have the advantage. Let us recall and be conscious that at some point in the past, Premier Deng Xiaoping stated, and I quote, "Let the future generations decide how to resolve the maritime territorial issues and just put the issue at the back burner," end of quote. My guess is what Deng Xiaoping meant by the future generation is when China has already fully attained and completed both elements of Fuxiang, which is wealth and power. Thank you and good day.
Thank you very much, Admiral Pama. We're so pleased that you were able to come all the way from Manila, although you arrived in a snowstorm. It's very important.
The greater challenge.
It's very important for Washington and others to hear the views of naval professionals and people like Admiral Pama who are working in the President's office, just how the encroachment of China's dream feels in up close, because at a great distance, it's not always felt with the same acuity. You raised, Admiral, Prime Minister Abe's speech at Davos, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Ken Jimbo, who's not here to speak for the Japanese government. He's an associate professor in the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University. He's also senior research fellow at the Cannon Institute for Global Studies and at the Tokyo Foundation. But in addition to Dr. Jimbo's deep understanding in working with Southeast Asian countries, he also feels in Japan some of the same encroachment in the East China Sea that Southeast Asia is feeling in the West Philippine Sea and in the South China Sea. So let me turn to Dr. Ken Jimbo for his remarks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking Patrick and CNAS for inviting me to this very important event, and also appreciate all the audiences who participated today's event despite this heavy snow. And I hope that the selection of the topic on Southeast Asia at least make you feel warmed up.
It's almost tropical.
Yeah. For many decades, that the security specialists who are looking at the Asia security dynamics have divided the dynamics in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia for long years, especially after the Vietnam War. Whereas the Northeast Asia's, you have a more like a power struggle, state sovereignty issues and territorial issues to be debated as a core of the security interest. And if you look at Southeast Asia, for earlier years, there are security perceptions are quite internally oriented. And then in the later years, they have adopted the ASEAN ways of dealing with the issues and also pursuing the community building approaches. And you find that there are not so much the semantic connection between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia for long years. It has been hard for major powers in Northeast Asian countries to directly involved in the Southeast Asian affairs, and also vice versa for the ASEAN to approach to Northeast Asia. But as you are aware that there are increasingly interconnectivity between two subregions, and largely it's because of the rise of China is the region-wide phenomena. But also as a domain, today's topic of the maritime security is the one which really connects the two sub-regions together, because that sea is, of course, interconnected from the Indian Ocean, Malacca Strait, South China Sea, East China Sea, all the way to Arctic. But at the same time, that the issue, as Patrick just mentioned, that of course that derived from the increasing of the maritime activity of China, placed similar types of security agenda that the regional country has to face. So that what the Philippines is trying to deal with China is also deeply connected in what Japan tried to deal also with China as well. So that roles of the major powers, encompassing its activities and roles in Southeast Asia is increasingly become important. So that Obama administration's pivot or rebalancing strategy is, I think, the icon of such, trying to reaching out its major power relationship towards Southeast Asia. And at the same time, it has been increasing importance of ASEAN of managing its own internal security agenda, but at the same time, the implication of how ASEAN's roles could be, referred by the outside powers, so that I think those two sub-regions are very much interconnected. Let me go on to the Japanese perspective. Southeast Asia has also increasingly become a region of Japan's strategic interest. It has already been 4 decades since Japan and ASEAN established their diplomatic relationship. And throughout these years, it was a strong commercial interest that led our bilateral relationship moving forward. It began by Japan's large-scale foreign direct investments, and ASEAN has been and remains to be one of the key production hubs of Japan's production networks in Asia. But in recent years, Japan's policy towards ASEAN is increasingly driven by strategic and security domains. And there are basically 4 reasons why this policy shift is happening. And undoubtedly, most are related with the rise of China. And number 1 is the stability of the South China Sea is, of course, Japan's vital interest, especially for securing the sea lanes of communication. However, due to the rapid rise of Chinese naval power and its activities, the situation in the South China Sea, especially since 2007 and 2008, have rapidly deteriorated. So growing gaps of the capabilities of maritime coast guards, law enforcement agencies, and the naval capability between China and ASEAN littoral states have created a widening mismatch for maintaining the balance of power, especially in the South China Sea. And secondly, Japan has become more sensitive on the connectivity of the situation between South China Sea and the East China Sea. The pattern of the Chinese assertive activities, just as Admiral Pama has just explained, and ASEAN's response and gains and the gains and losses of their interactions are quite important, especially how ASEAN can be successful in status quo management in South China Sea will have a strong impact on wider context of the Chinese maritime behavior, especially towards Japan. And number 3, Japan has a strong interest in how the rules and mechanisms for maritime security are established and to be consolidated in the South China Sea. In this sense, ASEAN-China Code of Conduct and the relevant confidence-building measures at the sea are crucially important milestone for rule-based maritime order, and which is the concept Japanese government has been repeatedly emphasizing. And in this context, it is obviously very welcoming to see ASEAN and China has begun its consultation on the COC since last October. But China's Hainan province has just announced the new maritime fishery regulation, and China also indicated the possible introduction of the new air defense identification zone that could extend to the South China Sea. Those actually movements could deteriorate the validity of such rule-based approach as well. So Japan wants to see highly legally binding code that would ensure the freedom of navigation, and Japan would not like to see that the ASEAN is making a major concession for the code of conduct. And number 4, finally, Japan pays increasing attention to the U.S. strategic involvement in the South China Sea. And this could go all across, ranging from the general perception of the credibility of the U.S. security commitment or the rebalancing strategy in this region, and also going to the narrow down to the actual management of the disputed territory, such as the Scarborough Shoal standoff between Philippines and China. So over the course of discussion with the U.S. colleagues and friends in past couple of months, many have told me that the Scarborough Shoal is so much different from Senkaku. Japan and the Philippines are different. However, when it comes to the alliance management issue, I think it may be very important to pursue the coordinated standards on these two issues in order to prevent or avoid the China's miscalculation on these issues. And by having these 4 reasons, and I think that will explain why Japan's policy towards Southeast Asia is increasingly driven by security and military domain. And I would like to go on for there are 3 basic policy imperatives or pillars that drives Japan's new engagement strategy towards Southeast Asia. Number 1 is that Japan is increasingly active in engaging in the military-to-military relationship with Southeast Asia and also through United States. As you are aware that Japan has been the formal participant for U.S.-Thai COBRA goals since 2005, and also Japanese self-defense force have significantly increased the profile of the activities in those exercises. So as at the U.S.-Philippine Balitecan series, we have been the formal member since 2012, and also at the Pacific Partnership. And also, if you look at the multilateral exercises, there has been a significant, I think, importance to be put at the Japan, U.S., Australia joint training. And especially in 2011, we had a naval exercise off the coast of Brunei, and that is also a significant, I think, signal that those webs of the cooperation among those hub and spokes members have signal that we will increase our cooperation in Southeast Asia as well. And also Japan has been active participant in the multilateral front, including ARF, disaster relief training exercises, and also at the ADMM Plus HADR since 2013 as well. That's number 1 imperative. The second strategic pillar, which I would like to highlight, is the financing aspect. Our new national security strategy and also the defense planning guideline, which has just released in last December, both refer to the concept, which is called the strategic use of official development assistance. And that is a key icon for reviewing our ODA strategy to be increasingly connected to the strategic concerns. And especially those strategic use of ODA is aiming at the capacity building of Southeast Asia littoral states. And this could alter, this could be different from the traditional commercial-driven or development-driven ODA policy and to become more robust strategic financing, especially towards ASEAN. So the items such as like ASEAN's critical infrastructures like airports, ports, roads, power generation stations, and electricity supplies, communications, and software developments. And these are all important and often highly compatible of their security constructions and defense developments as well. So that these commercial investments can also be deeply connected with the other military and security domains of our engagement in Southeast Asia as well. And finally, number 3 imperative or strategic approach we have tried to take is the arms export. In December 2011, Japan decided to ease the restrictions imposed under the 3 principles of arms exports, while maintaining the basic philosophy of restraining the exports. Overseas transfer of the defense equipments are now allowed in principle at the cases related to what we call the contributing to the peace and also advancing international cooperation, and which could be interpreted in many regards. So for example, Japan is providing the Philippines with patrol vessels for the Coast Guards and maritime communication system through ODA in coming years. And building upon such eased restrictions, I think Japan is gearing up to consider exporting patrol vessels and also for the future possibilities like aircraft, multi-purpose support ships to enhance ASEAN's maritime security capacities. So if these hardware assistance is coupled with a technical support and training by the Japan's Coast Guards and Maritime Self-Defense Force, I think Japan's support will be more effectively contributing to ASEAN's maritime security. So I'd like to finish my remarks by saying that there are increasing opportunities for U.S., Japan, ASEAN triangular networks works together that are not, which has not been exploited so far. For example, for the first pillar, as I mentioned, for the joint trainings and exercises, I think those 3 actors could develop regional foundation for military communications, especially for example like HADR and non-traditional security issues. And this has already been regarded as an important platform for military relations, but their operational levels should be further enhanced and upgraded. For example, U.S. Thai Cobra Gold exercises does include the robust operations such as amphibious assault operations for humanitarian assistance missions. And last year I have actually observed the mission, which was very significant. And I think these activities should be multilateralized among key players like Japan and other ASEAN members. And this also can be an important platform for engaging China as well. And China just recently announced that they are officially participating in the Cobra Gold exercises. And these types of practices also could be extended to Balitakan and also Pacific Partnership and other related exercises as well. And for the second and third pillar, which is financing and also the arms export, I would particularly like to raise the issue of importance to craft a joint approach to the capacity building of Philippines and to some extent towards Vietnam as well. In the Philippines, as I mentioned, Japan embarked on providing the Coast Guard patrol vessels and to promote the strategic use of ODA for building their capacity and offering the trainings. And the United States is also upgrading Navy and Marine Corps operational access to Philippines and also offer support for their defense capabilities. So I think these approaches should be further integrated in terms of jointly crafting the favorable balance of power by building Philippines' capacity for the maritime awareness in the South China Sea. And if the Tokyo and Washington further develop the common scope towards Manila and other Southeast Asia, our investment and provision of the assets will be further integrated. Not only these equipments and the trainings, but also wider financial arrangements to support their defense-related infrastructures as well. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Professor Jimbo, thank you very much. two comprehensive presentations, and now we're going to turn to start the discussion. We have about 30 minutes left for this panel, and we have two discussants. Our distinguished international speakers have had to traverse across the Pacific to arrive in Washington in a snowstorm. Our two discussants had to traverse across town in a foot of snow. I'm not sure which one was more difficult. Yeah, exactly. But extremely grateful to our discussants for making it in. We're going to begin with my colleague Zachary Hosford, who's the Basevich Fellow at the Center for New American Security. And maybe just a few comments thinking from a U.S. perspective, given the fact that we have represented here two allies of the United States trying to think through security in a region, Southeast Asia, where there isn't a strong security architecture, even if there's a strong set of institutions that are ASEAN-based, trying to develop the economy and the political support that all can benefit, including a rising China. And then we'll turn to Stephanie Klein-Albrandt, who is Director of the Asia-Pacific Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She's been most recently, though, on the ground in China, and it'd be great to hear from Stephanie about how this looks from China's perspective when you look out toward the South China Sea and the maritime space, both in terms of the challenge of securing Chinese interests, but also the opportunity for participating in things like RIMPAC and Cobra Gold exercises that we've heard expressed this morning. So Zachary Hosford, do you want to begin with a couple of points, and then we'll turn to Stephanie Klein-Albrandt.
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. And I'd like to also thank Admiral Pama and Ken-san for their very extensive comments this morning. I think we've heard a very sobering view of what the state of play is in Southeast Asia vis-a-vis China in and around the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea. And I'd like to just pick up on a couple of the points that were mentioned and maybe start to unpack those a little bit and see what other questions those might lead to. And one of those is on as Admiral Pama mentioned, the burden. Speaking of both Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's comments about which countries in the world have the responsibility for showing commitment to the issues, pushing for maintaining legal order and peace and stability in the South China Sea. Not only do I fully agree that this doesn't fall in 1 to 2 countries, because we all have an interest, and as Ken-san said, a vital interest in a free and open South China Sea, but the United States does need to take a leadership role as the primary security provider in the region. And so how does the United States go about doing this? One area we always hear about is whether or not the United States will ever ratify UNCLOS. And it's dangerous to even mention this anywhere near the Hill. You might get laughed out of the room because it seems like such a political impossibility to do so. But I don't think that's a good enough reason not to continue to push for it. This is something that, in addition to hearing our allies and partners push for this, but also industry and strong U.S. military support for ratification as well. So this is one area where the United States can very much make a strong show of support for continuing to push for peace and stability in the South China Sea. Another issue that we heard about this morning was on signaling. What exactly are the leaders in Beijing hearing? If there is some substantial amount of uncertainty, it seems to me, about what lessons Beijing might be learning from different actions that have taken place in the maritime domain in the past few years. As Ken-san pointed out, there is some debate over whether there's a difference substantially between how the United States would respond with respect to the Philippines or with respect to Japan. Ideally, there would be no debate about this at all, that the U.S. is steadfastly committed to both of its allies. But the question is, how does Beijing interpret this? And maybe we'll hear some comments from Stephanie on her thoughts on this. But when we're thinking about the salami slicing tactics in the South China Sea, Beijing still has to determine how big or how small to slice the salami. And it's not always going to be clear what actions will or will not draw a response, whether it's a legal or political, diplomatic, military response. And so this is something that we need to focus very, very hard on, because it is any uncertainty in this area can certainly lead us down the wrong path. On to the military power component and paramilitary power from China. As Admiral Pama mentioned, the China dream is now in place, but we're waiting now for China to establish its military power, which I think has been very well documented on the increase in capabilities we've witnessed over the past few years, whether it's from building the largest patrol boat to be deployed in the South China Sea, to the most recent deployment of an amphibious ship and destroyers through the Lombok Strait into the Indian Ocean. And again, this comes back to a point made by Ken-san about how there is no distinct East China Sea, South China Sea. They're all very connected. And I think that this also will include the Indian Ocean. There are reports now that India has now done its first flight testing from its new aircraft carrier, and so with this now being the largest ship permanently deployed to the Indian Ocean, we can't ignore this as well. And this is something that Robert Kaplan, Patrick had mentioned, something that he has written on very astutely. Another issue here that's come up is timing. There have been some views out there in the press, in some of the think tank community, that China doesn't have the ability, even if it announces an ADIZ in the South China Sea, does not have the capability to enforce it, or similarly with the fishing regulations from Hainan Island. And I would only say that China doesn't have to have the capability. First of all, now we're looking a couple years out at what will be the security environment in the coming years, and furthermore, it only has to be able to intercept some fishing vessels, or to make contact with some vessels during its patrols, in order to send signals that it is being assertive about how it's going to enforce the maritime activity in the South China Sea. So even though I think we'd all agree that China's military power has not progressed to the level of that of the United States to this point, it's still progressing enough that it is providing, it is offering some very difficult propositions for the United States and for other countries in the region. I think finally, one issue that we're going to see again that came up this morning is how will other countries in the region begin to help support others in the Asia-Pacific in terms of whether it's patrol boats, but even beyond that, looking a few years down the road. If certain countries they will have to make the decision, again, balancing, no one country wants to choose between China and the United States, very strong economic relations. Most Asian countries on the periphery of China list China as their number one trading partner. But at the same time, we are seeing this very real trend that countries in the region are reaching out more to two regional partners and helping bolster their security capabilities. So you can easily imagine this extending beyond patrol boats through Japanese ODA onto other countries, providing to Vietnam, to Indonesia, in a concerted effort to push back on Chinese behavior. And it might be seen as, I think we'll continue to hear the rhetoric from Beijing about a containment strategy, but whether or not that gains any traction, I don't think it will, but we will still continue to see, as long as China is continuing with its assertive behavior, there will be more of this dynamic in and around the South China Sea.
Zachary, thank you very much. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us on this snow day. And anything you'd like to contribute to this very big issue, but trying to help us understand maybe from China's perspective.
Good. So I'm not going to get into sort of the technical aspects of how why and how China wants to become a maritime power, because I think that's probably well understood. But in addition to this sense of enhancing its sense of security on its periphery and solidifying and legitimizing the CCP, given that sovereignty and territorial integrity is a core interest, I think it's important to point out this sort of psychological element, which is this feeling of trying to make up for the perceived failure of previous leaders to close the maritime gap in China's arc of security, which is what allowed these foreign invasions to come in. So I think there's a sense in Beijing that sort of extending control over the near seas is a kind of a healing of a psychological wound. And so that's why, that it contributes to everything else in driving Beijing to employ a range of diplomatic, administrative, and military tactics to expand its control in disputed areas in a way that is could be termed non-militarized coercion. And I think here it's important to point out this the indirect role. Of course, China's accelerating military modernization, focusing on limiting our ability to operate close to Chinese territory and the like. But there's a indirect role for Chinese military, which is never far from the action, serving to deter opponents from considering escalation and applying psychological and political pressure on regional leaders, but still with the plausible deniability that they're not deploying the military. And of course, these sweeping legal frameworks are all part of this. So getting to Zach's question, how big or small to slice the salami, I think there's this ongoing paradox and strategic dilemma really for China, because on the one hand, it needs and really does want a peaceful regional environment for economic development, which of course is integral to its own internal stability. To a certain extent, it wants the world to believe it's peacefully rising, but I don't think that that's as important. But at the same time, it needs to use, or it feels it needs to use its growing power to achieve these territorial goals, which is clearly at the expense not only of its neighbors, but of this type of regional stability. And at the same time, pushing interpretation of EEZ and the like. So really, the strategic dilemma is that they're trying to find a way to reconcile Asia to a dominant Chinese regional role without destabilizing the region or antagonizing the U.S. and its neighbors, which is obviously impossible. And so they're, they're doing the usual Chinese thing of, trying this, going too far, et cetera. I think what's interesting is that, and of course this is complicated because China, has all these claims to territories it doesn't control. I think there's the debate, at least the scholars in Beijing are trying to look at this now. I've heard they're looking at something called extended coercive diplomacy or extended coercion, which is essentially a reverse case of extended deterrence but involves three parties. And it's very funny when they talk about this in theoretical terms, because listen to how it's described. So you have three parties, and the coercer's adversary happens to be allied with another big power, right? And so how can a state coerce this adversary, which is allied with another big power? What conditions affect success and failure of this extended coercive diplomacy? And now there's a lot of looking at Scarborough, looking at Japan. How does this work? Here the ADAs does apply. They didn't expect this outcry. They pretty much admitted to me that they hadn't thought of the timing of the Biden visit. That obviously added several more weeks of very critical media coverage. And they recognize now, it depends on who's they. We'll get into, there's a whole spectrum, but I'm speaking of the moderate types that are trying to game this out. Recognizing that this overlapping the ADAs with South Korea was completely unproductive, as was the way in which it was done. And so the ADAs in South China Sea has been delayed, essentially, because of this. So the question is, how heavy-handed do you need to be? Like in Scarborough, did you need the plan in the background, given the Philippines' own capabilities? And, it's explained to me that the leaders, when they go in and do something like that, why hold back? You're going to go for the goal. The goal is to change the status quo and, utilize this sense of someone else starting the fight, which is not really necessary anymore, this reactive assertiveness. So there's also the carrots and sticks. So on the carrot side, there's a kind of, I think that CNAS is doing a lot of work in this area, the kind of ASEAN Charm Offensive 2. C had this July Politburo meeting, the September Code of Conduct consultations, the October work conference. And then the sticks are saved for countries like the Philippines and Japan to sort of make an example out of them. I think importantly here is this sort of, again, a psychological gap. Chinese officials insist, and they really do believe, that China has not taken any actions that violate freedom of navigation, that they still are committed to peaceful dialogue to resolve these disputes. They disclaim any desire to dominate Asia, right, declaring that they'll never seek hegemony, talking about cooperation and mutual respect, et cetera. But it's absolutely clear that Chinese elites and power, policymakers expect weaker countries to defer to Chinese wishes, and the way that they talk and the way that they act is clear. And obviously there's an unstated goal to eventually displace the US as the dominant power, if not to rectify in Chinese minds a situation where China wants control commensurate with what it sees as its growing power. Then there's this sort of the self-image as a victim, and this has come into play a lot in South China Sea. There really is this sort of, this 2009, the beginnings there of China being much more assertive, really has come out of this sense that we sat on this for half a century, it's all ours, and everyone else is out there, they're exploring, they're pulling resources, and we're the dummies because we're sitting back, and we're the victims. I'm not saying this is correct, it's just there really is this sort of victim, and it's obviously understandable given patriotic education and history and how the government has used that. The May 2009 deadline for submitting claims to the UN obviously reinforced that sense because everyone ran as they had to. So there's this sense all of a sudden of victim. So that's quite dangerous, right? China, which is obviously seen as and could be objectively characterized as taking assertive action, simply sees it as the minimum it has to do to sort of maintain face. I found interesting here, we have so many people from the region just talking about implications for U.S. policy in the region, not only U.S. policy, but broader, because the fact that the U.S. is out in front and trying to sort of go forward and support these norms, et cetera, makes it a U.S.-China clash, which makes countries in North and Southeast Asia nervous. I think the ADIS has made it such that our friends and partners in North and Southeast Asia all pretty much welcome a strengthened U.S. role, which hasn't always been the case. And there's always this problem of getting it right. Like we're asked to come in, and we come in, and we're the U.S., and we do it a bit. We don't do anything very nuanced, and usually then we're sort of criticized because we threw too much egg on China's face, et cetera. But what's clear is that Asian countries are now looking for us to stand up for rule of law, peaceful settlement of disputes, freedom of navigation, peace and stability, sustaining our role as a counterweight to China, but without getting into fights with China, right? Maintaining that relationship so that they don't have to choose between us. But in the past couple weeks, I've been speaking to NATO and EU countries, particularly Germany, which is starting to kind of come into this area because they need to chime in. This should be about norms and law and not about US-China necessarily, right? And as a continental power, China has been used to having different fixes for different problems. The idea now is a universal system. There's the same set of rules applying consistently. Customary maritime law is the same in the East China Sea, South China Sea, North Atlantic. So we need to try and also reach out to our other partners in Europe and NATO. They have a critical role to play, so it's not just being for or against China, it's about being for or against laws, institutions, or norms. ASEAN countries have told me that they want to feel the presence of the U.S. but not see it. As I told you, this is very hard to get right. I mean, Americans, we don't just sort of, it's not about feeling us. You're going to feel us, you're going to see us, you're going to hear us, you're going to have us in your face. So, with all the best intentions, right? But, so they want, my sense is that our friends in the region want countries also in Europe to seek clarification on what China's claims are. They very much welcome Danny Russell's pushing to sort of make clear that land-based title needs to generate maritime claims. But now they want, Europe also to push, and also push China on distinguishing whether geographic features are rocks or islands and the like. I think I'll stop. I had other things on Southeast China Sea, but I think that's quite enough. Yeah?
Well, it's not enough, but it's great. This is the problem. This subject is an ongoing subject, which is why we have an ongoing project on maritime security, because there are many facets to it and a lot of problems. On the challenge side, I mean, one of the questions is that even though there's a preponderance of thinking that this is limited, even non-militarized coercion, that this could still somehow accumulate, could even escalate. And so one of the questions really for the panel is to what extent are we sure there are limits on China, that it understands those limits? I mean, Zachary Hosford talked about signaling, and China, is it surprised sometimes when they see an overreaction, or is it an overreaction to what China does, or in fact did they expect this all along as they probe? The other part of that, in terms of creating the rules-based system, is when I listened to former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon, for instance, talk about the core principles that he tried to use in preparing for the Sunnyland Summit, in talking bilaterally with the Chinese. There are two core universal principles, just as Stephanie emphasized. One of them is UNCLOS, that Zachary Hosford mentioned, and in the law of the sea that comes from this, that we are trying to get universal support for, not just bilateral. The other one is the peaceful resolution of disputes. Of course, the problem with this salami tactics is how peaceful does it have to be, or how unpeaceful can your coercion be? And Admiral Pama and maybe Ken Jumbo, maybe you want to just give us a response to that and the discussants as well, very briefly.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I guess I can throw back the question is, how do you draw a line at sea? You can do that in the desert, but I mean, literally you can't at sea. And there's really a very thin line between what is basically acceptable on the conduct right out at sea. But usually we should appreciate the fact that the guys who are out there at sea are basically the young ones, the junior officers, and the fishermen, who are not basically so much keen or very well educated, or if you may, on the different things that are happening on a higher level. And it gets to be a slippery slope, if you may, down there. One minor incident could practically lead to the next incident. What is supposedly a challenge and just trying to identify who the other party is can lead to some ramming and eventually lead to some overreaction on the other side. And when that situation comes up, I mean, it gets to, as I said, it gets to be a very, very slippery slope. And as to where it stops, I mean, only the situation can tell. So I guess that's basically what we are trying to push right now. Like, for example, on the military side of it, or the naval side of it, there is a conscious and deliberate effort right now, even within the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, where they're pushing for what they call the Qs, or the Convention on Unalerted Encounters at Sea. Practically, from the last I heard, this is practically done, except there are a lot of other issues that China has put on the table, which basically, again, is delaying the improvement of that. There are a lot of opportunities that this can be avoided, but then again, the challenges on the ground or at sea is simply just tremendous, that we need a common effort and a unified effort for us to be able to lower down the temperature at sea.
Ken Jumbo?
Yes, briefly, for the case of Japan-China relationship at sea, I think we are in the pretty much immature level of learning process of especially in the concept of the escalation layers and escalation controls. And for example, the case that Chinese helicopter come close to the Japanese vessel, as close as like 50 meters, Chinese use of fire control radars to our self-defense force and vessels, all indicated that those kinds of common wisdoms have never been shared among two services as well. So I think we really need to have these sophisticated layers of the escalation among two coast guards and among also with the navies. That should be the very important process for having those lines of the escalation control. And also that could also extend to the air dimension as well, especially how to deal with management of the ADs is one. But second thing which particularly concerns me is the drone warfare. What if those UAV comes close to our territories, and then we'll have the overreaction towards it. That could be another window of opportunities for further escalation, which unfortunately Tokyo and Beijing haven't really come to the understanding of it.
Yes. And Zachary or Stephanie, would you like to add something?
Maybe just quickly on risk reduction measures, but I think clearly that the tension is here where China doesn't want to, has no incentive to really push forward on some of these measures. And I think former Assistant Secretary Kurt Campbell said it best when the way China views this as giving seatbelts to serial speeders. They don't want to encourage the behavior that we see as being falling well within international law and norms, but China wants to dissuade our behavior of being able to navigate freely on the oceans. And so the question is, how do we get past this impasse? How do we increase the likelihood that we can keep escalation controlled, even though China does not have the incentive to be terribly helpful in some of these conversations, as the Japanese government knows full well, and this fits and starts in the process of trying to hammer out some agreements with China.
Stephanie.
Yeah, so just quickly on that, I mean, China knows that it's a de facto reality that it needs to manage the islands together with Japan. But the position is that China sort of feels that it's sitting pretty, because as long as they don't get further concession out of Japan, that would solidify their overlapping administration, which is now de facto but not de jure. They don't want to come back to talks. And I think what's worrying is that many in the PLA and maritime surveillance are far from convinced of the need to talk to Japan, because frankly they're overconfident that they can avoid a mishap. I've heard actors in the PLA and maritime surveillance even say that a minor crisis could help their position as long as it doesn't escalate, which implies that they think that they can control escalation. And as Zach said, it's exactly, China fears a code of conduct is not in its interest because it will restrict its behavior while making it easier for the US and Japan to operate around China or around territories that China feels are theirs. So, in other words, China sees direct talks with Japan about protocols or rules of the road, CBMs, as a clear compromise, as opposed to the logical thing to do to avoid a misstep. Obviously, no one needs to reinvent the wheel. There have been lots of discussions already between the Chinese and the Japanese side. We have a track 1.5 with the Chinese and the Japanese, and we've tried to sort of resuscitate this. And then, there's a larger conceptual issue with which you're all familiar, which is that we Americans think of code of conduct as sort of being from the bottom up, using a mechanism to avoid conflict and then building confidence, whereas Chinese hold that out unless there's a sort of a political understanding or the top level feels that they have all of this trust with the other side, they're not willing to enter into discussions about details. So I think China's sort of decided on its interim strategy in the East China Sea. They feel comfortable. They feel that they could wait until Japan decides that it's ready to make this concession, and they, whatever diplomatic language that is, and they're willing to bear the risks of an accidental incident because it's sort of a lack of understanding of their own silo, how siloed their own system is, and how dangerous it is. For example, that every single incident over the last half decade has had to be announced to Ministry of Foreign Affairs either by a Western diplomat or the press, and these are the guys that are going to have to be responsible for walking things back in the case of an incident. Overconfidence, overreaching, I guess.
A very important point on which we're going to end this panel, Stephanie.
Sorry,
No,
I went on too
no,
long.
you did not.
You end a panel.
No, you did not go on too long.
They were trying to shut you up.
We're going to make sure that there's room and time for our excellent second panel that's going to follow. But first, please join me in thanking Admiral Alex Pama, Dr. Ken Jimbo, Zachary Hosford, and Stephanie Klein-Albrandt for their participation in this panel. Thank you.